Now that you've learned that hypotheses are derived from inferential research questions, it is now time for you to learn how to formulate the hypothesis and how to state it in your paper. So we have two types of statistical hypothesis. We have the null and the alternative hypothesis. Now, what is the difference between these two types of statistical hypothesis? So let's try to analyze our example. So we have here our null hypothesis indicated by H sub 0. Okay, so H sub 0. So class, hypothesis is an example of a, let's say, a statistical term. Okay, and since hypothesis is an example of a statistical term, it means that it must be italicized. Okay, so in writing your null hypothesis, make sure that the symbol H sub 0 is italicized. Okay, so the null hypothesis, as you can observe, it always indicates that there is no significant difference. Okay, there is no significant difference between the groups, okay, in terms of the measurable variable. Therefore, that is the description of our null hypothesis. So null hypothesis states that there is no significant difference between or among the groups in terms of the measurable variables. Okay, you must state that there is no significant difference. Always take note of that. So if it states there is no significant difference, it means it is a null hypothesis. Okay, so if you state that there is no significant difference, okay, can we say that we state that our product, let's say, our output is effective or not? So here, if we state our null hypothesis, we hypothesize or we imply that our product can have no effect. Okay? It can have no effectiveness, or let's say less effectiveness. Therefore, class, stating that our product or our output has no effectiveness must be initially stated in our paper. Okay, meaning to say, null hypothesis is a kind of hypothesis that states no significant difference must be the one that is stated in our paper. And the null hypothesis are actually written after the statement of the problem. Okay, it must be the kind of hypothesis that should be initially stated after the statement of the problem. And how do we write our null hypothesis in our paper? Okay, so let's take a look at our example again. Okay, this is how we write the null hypothesis. Aside from writing the symbol in an italicized manner, please take a look with the indentation. Okay, so you notice, class, that the first line of the hypothesis is flushed to the left, while the second and the succeeding line, it is flushed to the right. Okay? So this kind of indentation, where the first line is flushed to the left, and where the second and succeeding lines are flushed to the right, is known as the hanging indentation. Okay? So therefore, class, we write the null hypothesis using a hanging indentation. Okay? And also, class, aside from it is written using a hanging indentation, notice the quantity of our null hypothesis. Okay? How many null hypotheses must be written? Okay? Where should we base the quantity of our null hypothesis? Okay, earlier class, we mentioned that our hypotheses are derived from our inferential research questions. And how many inferential research questions do we have in our presentation? Okay, we have one. Okay, note class that we have one inferential research question. And also take note that inferential research questions contain measurable variables. Okay, so how many measurable variables do we have? We have two. Okay, so we try to multiply this number of inferential questions, so we have one, times the number of measurable variable. And so we have 1 times 2, we have 2. Therefore, class, the product of the number of inferential statistics, or let's say inferential research questions rather, and the number of the measurable variables will give us the number of the hypothesis needed in our paper. Okay, so do you get the idea here, class? We have one inferential research questions, and for each inferential research question, we have two measurable variables. Therefore, 1 times 2 is equals to 2. Therefore, we should write, or let's say we should indicate two null hypotheses based on our inferential research questions. Okay, so this will serve as our fourth guideline in writing your null hypothesis. The number of null hypotheses is based on the number of measurable variables per inferential research questions. Okay, so for example, class, what if you have two inferential research questions? And for each inferential research question, let's say you have 5 measurable variables. So how many null hypotheses should we write? So we have 2 times 5 equals 10. So we should write 10, okay? 10 null hypotheses, okay? And take a look, class, how it is written, okay? We have, there is no significant difference. There is no significant difference. Okay, and then the preceding lines are actually the same. However, they only differ in the last word. And the last word is actually pertaining to our measurable variables. So that is how we write our null hypothesis. Okay, there is no significant difference between or among the groups in terms of the measurable variables. Okay, so that is how we write our null hypothesis. Okay, now, say that you already performed statistical analysis to test your hypothesis. So let's say that you already performed stats to test your hypothesis. Okay, and your statistical analysis showed that there is a significant difference. Okay, meaning to say we falsified this part, that there is no significant difference because your statistical analysis showed that there is a significant difference. Therefore, class, what will be our decision? Okay, do we accept or do we reject the null hypothesis? Okay, so our decision here, class, is to reject the null hypothesis. Why? Because our findings falsified our null hypothesis. And once our findings, through the use of our statistical treatments, falsified our null hypothesis, we should reject it. And what should we accept in return? So, after rejecting the null hypothesis, we must accept the alternative hypothesis. Okay? So, the alternative hypothesis will be, okay, there is a significant difference between the varied concentrations of Mabolo fruit as an alternative source of ethanol to the control group in terms of volatility and flammability. So, take note, class, here. Okay, we have H sub 1. So H sub 1 is the symbol for alternative hypothesis. However, class, we stated that we only write the null hypothesis after the statement of the problem. Therefore, where can we see the accepted alternative hypothesis if we reject the null hypothesis? Okay, so the alternative hypothesis shall only appear in the results and discussion part of your paper. Okay, it will only appear if you rejected the null hypothesis. Okay, if you falsified the null hypothesis, then it will be the only time that the alternative hypothesis will appear in the results and discussion part of your paper. Okay, so that is how we define the alternative hypothesis. So the alternative hypothesis, okay, is defined as the hypothesis that state that there is a significant difference. Okay, and the alternative hypothesis is indicated by H sub 1 or H sub A. Okay, and another thing, class, okay, the one thing that we mentioned earlier, the alternative hypothesis is only accepted and written if the null hypothesis was rejected. So the alternative hypothesis will not appear if the null hypothesis is not rejected. Okay? And lastly, the alternative hypothesis shall only appear in the results and discussion part of your paper. So the results and discussion part is actually the chapter 4 of your research paper. Okay? So it will not appear after the statement of the problem. You only write the null hypothesis after the statement of the problem. So that concludes our lesson dealing with the statement of the problem and hypothesis of your study. Okay, so for our next video presentation, we will now be discussing on how to write your significance of the study.